God's prophets in general history. Epamenonas. God's choice to lead the war against tyranny. The Qur'an and the Torah mention Epamenonas' war with Sparta. It is through Epamenonas' war with Sparta that we can conclude that Alexander the Great is the prophet Solomon, and that his father Philip the Macedonian is the prophet David, as described in the Qur'an and the Torah. We will focus on the story of the war of Talut and Goliath mentioned in Surah al-Baqarah. Did you not see the son of the sons of Israel after Moses, when they said to my prophet to them, he sent us to the king, they said, and that we will not fight in the path of God? And we have been brought out from our homes and our children, so when they have been written, they are from them. And God is aware of those who are unjust, and their prophet said to them that God has sent you a king, and there was no capacity of money. He said that God has chosen it to you, and increased it simply in the knowledge and the body, and God will give him the king and the king of God. And their prophet said to them, indeed, the sign of his kingdom is that the ark will come to you, containing a piece from your Lord, and a remnant of what the family of Moses and the family of Aaron left behind, carrying it. Indeed, and that is a sign for you, if you are believers. Then when Talut separated with the soldiers, he said, indeed, Allah will test you with the river, so whoever drinks from it is not of me, and whoever does not taste it, then it is from me, except he who scoops a scoop with his hand, and they drink from it, except a little of it. When he passed it, he and those who believed with him said, we have no strength today against Goliath and his armies. Those who think they will meet God said, how many a small group has defeated a large group, by God's permission, with those who are patient. And when they went out against Goliath and his soldiers, saying, our Lord, bestow upon us patience, and make our feet firm, and grant us victory over the disbelieving people. So they defeated them with permission God, and David killed Goliath, and God gave him dominion and wisdom, and taught him whatever he pleased. And had God not repulsed people one by another, the earth would have been corrupted, but God is in control and a bounty upon the worlds. These are the signs of God. We recite it to you in truth, and indeed you are among the messengers. The time of the story occurred after the prophet Moses. We will take the following points from the events of the story. First, there are people who were expelled from their land, and that these people asked a cleric to ask God to send them a king so that they could be killed with him. Second, the cleric came and told them that God had chosen Talut as their king. Third, he describes Talut as a poor man, strong in body, and rich in knowledge. Fourth, these people object to Talut because of his poverty, so the cleric says that God sent him to them, and that the possessions of the prophet Moses and Aaron are evidence of the sanctity of this war. Fifth, Goliath goes to war and a large number of people who were expelled from their land withdraw, due to the strength of Goliath's army, and its large number. Sixth, Talut's army passes through a river before reaching the battlefield. After that, Talut organizes his army and attacks Goliath's army, defeating them. Seventh, the name of the prophet David appears, who will kill Goliath and become king after the war. This is a short story. All that is required of us is to search for the war that Philip of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, fought before he became king of Macedonia, at a young age missing, but he did not mention a friend. Pelopidas and compared them between the rich and the poor. Plutarch says, Aristotle says, either make no use of their wealth through avarice, or abuse it through prodigality, and so they are forever slaves, these to their pleasures, those to their business, to the rest, accordingly, thankfully profited by the kindness and liberality of Pelopidas towards them. But Epamenonas was the only one of his friends, whom he could not persuade to share his wealth. Pelopidas, however, shared the poverty of this friend, and gloried in modest attire, meager diet, readiness to undergo hardship, straightforward service as a soldier, and he was ashamed to let men think that he spent more upon his person than the poorest Theban. Now Epamenonas, whose poverty was hereditary and familiar, made it still more light and easy by philosophy, and by electing at the onset to lead a single life. They were also fitted by nature for the pursuit of every excellence, and in like measure, except that Pelopidas delighted more in exercising the body, Epamenonas in storing the mind, so that the one devoted his leisure hours to bodily exercise and hunting, the other to lectures and philosophy. Both had many claims upon the world's esteem, but wise men consider none of these so great as the unquestioned goodwill and friendship, which subsisted between them from first to last through all their struggles, and campaigns and civil services. The people of Thebes were exiled by Sparta. Plutarch says, but when the Lacedaemonians deprived Phoebus of his command, and fined him 100,000 drachmas, and yet held the Cadmea with a garrison notwithstanding, all the rest of the Greeks were amazed at their inconsistency, since they punished the wrongdoer, but approved his deed. And as for the Thebans, they had lost their ancestral form of government and were enslaved by Archias and Lentitus, nor had they hopes of any deliverance from this tyranny. which they saw was guarded by the dominant military power of the Spartans, and could not be pulled down unless those Spartans should somehow be deposed from their command of land and sea. Nevertheless, when Titus and his associates, learning that the fugitive Thebans were living at Athens, where they were not only in favor with the common people, but also honored by the nobility, secretly plotted against their lives, and sending men who were unknown, they treacherously killed Androclides, but failed in their designs upon the rest. There came also letters from the Lacedaemonians charging the Athenians not to harbor or encourage the exiles, but to expel them as men declared common enemies by the allied cities. The Athenians, however, not only yielding to their traditional and natural injustices of humanity, but also making a grateful return for the kindness of the Thebans, who had been most ready to aid them in restoring their democracy, and had passed a decree that if any Athenians marched through Boeotia against the tyrants in Athens, no Boeotian should see or hear them, did no harm to the Thebans in their city. He went to the Roman historian Diodorus Siculus. From his book The Library of History, the historian Diodorus Siculus mentions that there were events that occurred before the Battle of Leuctra, 371 BC. All that is required of us is to focus on these events, and the Eleans celebrated the 102nd Olympiad, in which Damon of 3 won the stadium race. During their term of office, after the Lacedaemonians had held the supremacy in Greece for almost 500 years, a divine portent foretold the loss of their empire, for there was seen in the heavens during the course of many nights, a great blazing torch which was named from its shape a flaming beam, and a little later, to the surprise of all, the Spartans were defeated in a great battle, and irretrievably lost their supremacy. Some of the students of nature ascribed the origin of the torch to natural causes, voicing the opinion that such apparitions occur of necessity at appointed times, and that in these matters the Chaldeans in Babylon and the other astrologers succeeded in making accurate prophecies. These men, they say, are not surprised when such a phenomenon occurs, but rather if it does not, since each particular constellation has its own peculiar cycle, and they complete these cycles through age-long movements in appointed courses. At any rate, this torch had such brilliancy, they report, and its light such strength that it cast shadows on the rather similar to those cast by the moon. During their term of office the Thebans, since they were not participants in the truce, were forced to undertake alone the war with the Lacedaemonians, for there was no city that could legally join them, because all had agreed to the general peace. The Lacedaemonians, since the Thebans were isolated, determined to fight them, and reduce Thebes to complete slavery. And since the Lacedaemonians were making their preparations without concealment and the Thebans were destitute of allies, everyone assumed that they would be easily defeated by the Spartans. Accordingly, some of the Greeks who were friendly to the Thebans sympathized with them at the prospect of defeat, while others, who were at odds with them, were overjoyed at the thought that Thebes would in a trice be reduced to utter slavery. Finally, the Lacedaemonians, their huge army ready, gave command of it to Cleombrotus their king, and first of all sent envoys ahead to Thebes, directing the Thebans to permit all of the Boeotian cities to be independent, to people Plataea and Thespe, and to restore the land to its former owners. When the Thebans replied that they never meddled with affairs in Laconia and the Spartans had no right to touch those of Boeotia, such being the tenor of their answers, the Lacedaemonians sent Cleombrotus forth immediately with his army against Thebes, and the Spartan allies were eager for the war, confident that there would be no contest or battle but that they would master the Boeotians without a struggle. The Spartans accordingly advanced till they came to Coronia, where they encamped and waited for such of their allies as were tardy. The Thebans, in view of the presence of the enemy, first voted to remove their wives and children to safety in Athens, then chose Epamenonas general and turned over to him the command in the war, giving him as his advisors 6 Boeotarchs. Epamenonas, having conscripted for the battle all Thebans of military age and the other Boeotians, who were willing and qualified, led forth from Thebes his army, numbering in all not more than 6,000. As the soldiers were marching out from the city, it seemed to many that unfavorable omens appeared to the armament, for by the gates Epamenonas was met by a blind herald, who, seeking recovery of runaway slaves, just as was usual, cried his warning not to take them from Thebes nor to spirit them away, but to bring them home and keep them secure. Now the older people amongst those who heard the herald considered it an omen for the future, but the younger folk kept quiet so as not to appear through cowardice to hold Epamenonas back from the expedition. But Epamenonas replied to those who told him that he must observe the omens. One only omen is best, to fight for the land that is ours. Though Epamenonas astounded the cautious by his forthright answer, a second omen appeared more unfavorable than the previous one. For as the clerk advanced with a spear and a ribbon attached to it, and signaled the orders from headquarters, a breeze came up and, as it happened, the ribbon was torn from the spear, and wrapped itself around a slab that stood over a grave, and there were buried in this spot some Lacedaemonians and Peloponnesians who had died in the expedition under Agesilaus. Some of the older folk, who again chanced to be there, protested earnestly against leading the force out in the face of the patent opposition of the gods, but Epamenonas, deigning them no reply, led forth his army, thinking that considerations of nobility and regard for justice should be preferred as motives to the omens in question. Epamenonas accordingly, who was trained in philosophy and applied sensibly the principles of his training, was at the moment widely criticized, but later in the light of his successes would be considered to have excelled in military shrewdness, and did contribute the greatest benefits to his country, for he immediately led forth his army, seized in advance the pass at Coronia, and encamped there. Cleombrotus, learning that the enemy had seized the pass first, decided against forcing a passage there, proceeded instead through Phocis, and, when he had traversed the shore road, which was difficult, entered Boeotia without danger. In his passage he took some of the fortresses and seized 10 triremes. Later, when he reached the place called Leuctra, he encamped there and allowed the soldiers to recover after their march. As the Boeotians neared the enemy in their advance, and then, after surmounting some ridges, suddenly caught sight of the Lacedaemonians covering the entire plain of Leuctra, they were astounded at beholding the great size of the army, and when the Boeotarchs held a conference to decide whether they ought to remain and fight it out with an army that many times outnumbered them, or whether they should retreat and join battle in a commanding position, it chanced that the votes of the leaders were equal, for of the 6 Boeotarchs, 3 thought that they should withdraw the army, and 3 that they should stay and fight it out, and among the latter Epamenonas was numbered. In this great and perplexing deadlock, the Boeotarch came to vote, whom Epamenonas persuaded to vote with him, and thus he carried the day. So the decision to stake all on the issue of battle was thus ratified. But Epamenonas, who saw that the soldiers were superstitious on account of the omens that had occurred, earnestly desired through his own ingenuity and strategy to reverse the scruples of the soldiery. Accordingly, a number of men having recently arrived from Thebes, he persuaded them to say that the arms on the temple of Heracles, his prophet Moses, surprisingly disappeared, and that word had gone abroad in Thebes that the heroes of old had taken them up, and set off to help the Boeotians. He placed before them another man as one who had recently ascended from the cave of Trophonius, who said that the god had directed them, when they won at Leuctra, to institute a contest with crowns for prizes in honor of Zeus the king. They're talking about Ark of the Covenant. This indeed is the origin of this festival which the Boeotians now celebrate at Lobadia. An aider and abettor of this device was Leandrius 40 for the Spartan, who had been exiled from Lacedaemonian and was then a member of the Theban expedition. He was produced in the assembly and declared that there was an ancient saying amongst the Spartans, that they would lose the supremacy when they should be defeated at Leuctra at the hands of the Thebans. Certain local oracle mongers likewise came up to Epamenonas, saying that the Lacedaemonians were destined to meet with a great disaster, by the tomb of the daughters of Leuctrus and Cetisis for the following reasons. Leuctrus was the person for whom this plain was named. His daughters and those of a certain Cetisis as well, being maidens, were violated by some Lacedaemonian ambassadors. The outraged girls, unable to endure their misfortune, called down curses on the country that had sent forth their ravishers and took their lives by their own hands. Many other such occurrences were reported, and when Epamenonas had convened an assembly, and exhorted the soldiers by the appropriate pleas to meet the issue, they all shifted their resolutions, rid themselves of their superstition, and with courage in their hearts stood ready for the battle. There came also at this time to aid the Thebans an allied contingent from Thessaly, 1,500 infantry, and 500 horsemen, commanded by Jason. He persuaded both the Boeotians and the Lacedaemonians to make an armistice, and so to guard against the caprices of fortune. When the truce came into effect, Cleombrotus set out with his army from Boeotia, and there came to meet him another large army of Lacedaemonians and their allies under the command of Archidamus, son of Agesilaus. For the Spartans, seeing the preparedness of the Boeotians, and taking measures to meet their boldness and recklessness in battle, had dispatched the second army to overcome by the superior number of their combatants the daring of the enemy. Once these armies had united, the Lacedaemonians thought it cowardly to fear the valor of the Boeotians, so they disregarded the truce and with high spirits returned to Leuctra. The Boeotians too were ready for the battle, and both sides marshaled their forces. Now on the Lacedaemonian side, the descendants of Heracles were stationed as commanders of the wings, namely Cleombrotus the king and Archidamus, son of the king Agesilaus, while on the Boeotian side Epamenonas, by employing an unusual disposition of his own, was enabled through his own strategy to achieve his famous victory. He selected from the entire army the bravest men and stationed them on one wing, intending to give to the finish with them, himself. The weakest he placed on the other wing, and instructed them to avoid battle, and withdraw gradually during the enemy's attack. So then, by arranging his phalanx in oblique formation, he planned to decide the issue of the battle by means of the wing in which were the elite. When the trumpets on both sides sounded the charge, and the army simultaneously with the first onset raised the battle cry, the Lacedaemonians attacked both wings with their phalanx in crescent formation, while the Boeotians retreated on one wing, but on the other engaged the enemy in double quick time as they met in hand-to-hand combat. At first both fought ardently and the battle was evenly poised. Shortly, however, as Epamenonas' men began to derive advantage from their valor and the denseness of their lines, many Peloponnesians began to fall, for they were unable to endure the weight of the courageous fighting of the elite corps. Of those who had resisted, some fell and others were wounded, taking all the blows in front. Now as long as King Cleombrotus of the Lacedaemonians was alive, and had with him many comrades in arms, who were quite ready to die in his defense, it was uncertain which way the scales of victory inclined. But when, though he shrank from no danger, he proved unable to bear down his opponents, and perished in an heroic resistance after sustaining many wounds, then, as masses of men thronged about his body, there was piled up a great mound of corpses. There being no one in command of the wing, the heavy column led by Epamenonas bore down upon the Lacedaemonians, and at first by sheer force caused the line of the enemy to buckle somewhat. Then, however, the Lacedaemonians, fighting gallantly about their king, got possession of his body, but were not strong enough to achieve victory, for as the corps of elite outdid them in feats of courage, and the valor and exhortations of Epamenonas contributed greatly to its prowess, the Lacedaemonians were with great difficulty forced back. At first, as they gave ground they would not break their formation, but finally, as many fell and the commander who would have rallied them had died, the army turned and fled in utter rout. Epamenonas' corps pursued the fugitives, slew many who opposed them, and won for themselves a most glorious victory, for since they had met the bravest of the Greeks, and with a small force had miraculously overcome many times their number, they won a great reputation for valor. The highest praises were accorded the general Epamenonas, who chiefly by his own courage, and by his shrewdness as a commander had defeated in battle the invincible leaders of Greece. More than 4,050 Lacedaemonians fell in the battle, but only about 300 Boeotians. Following the battle they made a truce to allow for taking up the bodies of the dead and the departure of the Lacedaemonians to the Peloponnese. Such was the outcome of events. Relating to the Battle of Leuctra, Philip of Macedon appears and joins the army Epamenonas. The Thebans, having accomplished in 85 days all that is narrated above, and having left a considerable garrison for Maine, returned to their own land. The Lacedaemonians, who had unexpectedly got rid of their enemies, sent to Athens a commission of the most distinguished Spartans, and came to an agreement over the supremacy. The Athenians should be masters of the sea, the Lacedaemonians of the land. But after this in both cities they set up a joint command. The Arcadians now appointed Lycomedes their general, gave him the corps they called their elite, 5,000 in number, and took the field against Pellene in Laconia. Having taken the city by force, they slew the Lacedaemonians who had been left behind there as a garrison, over 300 men, enslaved the city, devastated the countryside, and returned home before assistance came from the Lacedaemonians. The Boeotians, summoned by the Thessalians to liberate their cities, and to overthrow the tyranny of Alexander of Fair, dispatched Pelopidas with an army to Thessaly, after giving him instructions to arrange Thessalian affairs, in the interests of the Boeotians. Having arrived in Larissa and found the Acropolis garrisoned by Alexander of Macedon, he obtained its surrender. Then proceeding into Macedon, where he made an alliance with Alexander the Macedonian king, he took from him as a hostage his brother Philip, whom he sent to Thebes. When he had settled Thessalian affairs as he thought fit in the interest of the Boeotians, he returned home. After these events, Arcadians, Argives, and Eleans, making common cause, decided to take the field against the Lacedaemonians, and having sent a commission to the Boeotians prevailed on them to join in the war. They appointed Epamenonas commander along with other Boeotarchs, and dispatched 7,000 foot and 600 horse. The Athenians, hearing that the Boeotian army was about to pass into the Peloponnese, dispatched an army and Chabrias as general against them. He arrived in Corinth, added to his number Megarians, Pellenians, and also Corinthians, and so gathered a force of 10,000 men. Later, when the Lacedaemonians and other allies arrived at Corinth, there were assembled no less than 20,000 men all told. They decided to fortify the approaches and prevent the Boeotians from invading the Peloponnese. From Cenchreae to Lechium they fenced off the area with palisades and deep trenches. And since the task was quickly completed owing to the large number of men and their enthusiasm, they had every spot fortified before the Boeotians arrived. Epamenonas came with his army, inspected the fortifications, and, perceiving that there was a spot very easy of access, where the Lacedaemonians were on guard, first challenged the army to come forth to a pitched battle, though they were almost 3 times his number. Then when not a man dared to advance beyond the fortified line, but all remained on the defensive in their palisaded camp, he launched a violent attack upon them. Accordingly, throughout the whole area heavy assaults were made, but particularly against the Lacedaemonians, for their terrain was easily assailed, and difficult to defend. Great rivalry arose between the two armies, and Epamenonas, who had with him the bravest of the Thebans, with great effort forced back the Lacedaemonians, and, cutting through their defense, and bringing his army through, passed into the Peloponnese, thereby accomplishing a feat no whit inferior to his former mighty deeds. Battle of Mantinea. Both sides eagerly drew together for the decisive conflict, their armies in battle formation, while the soothsayers, having sacrificed on both sides, declared that victory was foreshadowed by the gods in the disposition of forces. The Mantineans with the rest of the Arcadians occupied the right wing, with the Lacedaemonians as their neighbors and supporters, and next to these were Eleans and Achaeans, and the weaker of the remaining forces occupied the center, while the Athenians filled the left. The Thebans themselves had their post on the left wing, supported by the Arcadians, while they entrusted the right to the Argives. The remaining multitude filled the middle of the line: Euboeans, Locrians, Sicyonians, Manians, Malians, Aenianians, together with Thessalians and the remaining allies. Both sides divided the cavalry and placed contingents on each wing. Such was the array of the armaments, and now as they approached one another, the trumpet sounded the battle charge. The armies raised the battle shout, and by the very volume of their cries betokened their victory. Now as the Athenian horse attacked the Theban, they suffered defeat not so much because of the quality of their mounts nor yet on the score of the riders' courage or experience in horsemanship, for in none of these departments was the Athenian cavalry deficient, but it was in the numbers and equipment of the light-armed troops, and in their tactical skill that they were far inferior to their opponents. Indeed, they had only a few javelin throwers, whereas the Thebans had 3 times as many slingers, and javelin throwers sent them from the regions about Thessaly. These people practiced from boyhood assiduously this type of fighting and consequently were wont to exercise great weight in battles because of their experience in handling these missiles. Consequently the Athenians, who were continually being wounded by the light-armed and were harried to exhaustion by the opponents who confronted them, all turned and fled. But having fled beyond the flanks, they managed to retrieve their defeat, for even in their retreat they did not break their own phalanx. And encountering simultaneously the Euboeans and certain mercenaries, who had been dispatched to seize the heights nearby, they gave battle and slew them all. Now the Theban horse did not follow up the fugitives, but, assailing the phalanx opposing them, strove zealously to outflank the infantry. The battle was a hot one. The Athenians were exhausted and had turned to flee, when the Elean cavalry commander, assigned to the rear, came to the aid of the fugitives, and, by striking down many Boeotians, reversed the course of the battle. So while the Elean cavalry by their appearance in this fashion on the left wing, retrieved the defeat their allies had sustained, on the other flank both cavalry forces, lashed at one another and the battle hung for a short time in the balance. But then, because of the number and valor of the Boeotian and Thessalian horsemen, the contingents on the Mantinean side were forced back, and with considerable loss took refuge with their own phalanx. As for the Lacedaemonians, when they saw that Epamenonas in the fury of battle, was pressing forward too eagerly, they charged him in a body. As missiles flew thick and fast about him, he dodged some, others he fended off, still others he pulled from his body, and used to ward off his attackers. But while struggling heroically for the victory, he received a mortal wound in the chest. As the spear broke and the iron point was left in his body, he fell of a sudden, his strength sapped by the wound. About his body a rivalry ensued in which many were slain on both sides, but at last with difficulty by their superiority in bodily strength, the Thebans wore the Lacedaemonians out. As the latter turned and fled, the Boeotians pursued for a short time but turned back, considering it most essential to take possession of the bodies of the dead. So, when the trumpeters sounded recall for their men, all withdrew from battle and both sides set up trophies claiming the victory. In fact, the Athenians had defeated the Euboeans and mercenaries in the battle for the heights, and were in possession of the dead, while the Boeotians, because they had overpowered the Lacedaemonians, and were in possession of the dead, were for awarding the victory to themselves. So for a long time neither side sent envoys to recover its dead, in order that it should not appear to yield the primacy, But later, when the Lacedaemonians were the first to have sent a herald to ask for the recovery of their dead, each side buried its own. Epamenonas, however, was carried back to camp still living, and the physicians were summoned. But when they declared that undoubtedly as soon as the spear point should be drawn from his chest, death would ensue, with supreme courage he met his end. For first summoning his armor-bearer, he asked him if he had saved his shield. On his replying yes and placing it before his eyes, he again asked which side was victorious. At the boy's answer that the Boeotians were victorious, he said, "It is time to die," and directed them to withdraw the spear point. His friends press cried out in protest, and one of them said, "You die childless, Epamenonas," and burst into tears. To this he replied, "No, by Zeus, on the contrary I leave behind 2 daughters, Leuctra and Montanea, my victories." Then when the spear point was withdrawn, without any commotion he breathed his last. For us who are wont to accord to the demise of great men the appropriate meed of praise, it would be most unfitting, so we think, to pass by the death of a man of such stature, with no word of note, for it seems to me that he surpassed his contemporaries not only in skill and experience in the art of war, but in reasonableness and magnanimity as well. For among the generation of Epamenonas were famous men, Pelopidas the Theban, Timothes and Conon, also Chabrias and Iphicrates, Athenians all, and, besides, Agesilas the Spartan, who belonged to a slightly older generation. Still earlier than these, in the times of the Medes and Persians, there were Solon, Themistocles, Miltiades, and Cimon, Myronides, and Pericles, and certain others in Athens, and in Sicily Gelon, son of Dynamis, and still others. All the same, if you should compare the qualities of these with the generalship and reputation of Epamenonas, you would find the qualities possessed by Epamenonas far superior, for in each of the others you would discover but one particular superiority as a claim to fame. In him, however, all qualities combined, for in strength of body and eloquence of speech, furthermore in elevation of mind, contempt of lucre, fairness, and, most of all, in courage and shrewdness in the art of war, he far surpassed them all. So it was that in his lifetime his native country acquired the primacy of Hellas, but when he died lost it, and constantly suffered change for the worse, and finally, because of the folly of its leaders, experienced slavery and devastation. So Epamenonas, whose valor was approved among all men, in the manner we have shown met his death. The Sicilians talk about the hero Epamenonas ends, after which Philip the Macedonian becomes king of Macedonia, and after that, king of the children of Hellas or the children of Israel. The Torah mentions that the prophet David was king of Hebron, and after that he was king of Israel. Note: the Theban war against Sparta is a replica of Russia's war with Ukraine. It is a war between tyranny and democracy. The Qur'an described the Spartans in this war as infidels. The Bible and the war of Epamenonas with Sparta. The Torah mentioned war in the Book of Judgments and the first Book of Kings, but it was written differently, especially in the Book of Kings, which was written in the style of the poems of Homer and Hesiod. The Book of Judgment, chapter 19. In the chapters referred to above, we read about a Levite man, who was coming from Bethlehem, that is, the city of Philip the Macedonian, who took for himself a concubine or a slave girl. This poor woman seems to be a king, as he controls her and directs her as he pleases. But one day the unthinkable happened. The slave girl decided to escape. Why? In the Arabic translation known as the Van Dyck Bustani Smith translation, we read, "And his concubine committed adultery against him, and went from him to her father's house." As for the Book of Life, the interpretive translation of the Bible, we read, "But she was angry with him, so she took refuge in her father's house." 2:19. The first translation is based on the Hebrew text, Masoretic, and the Syriac text, Peshitta, simple, of the Old Testament, while the second translation follows the Greek translation, Septuagint, and the ancient Latin translation of the Old Testament. I prefer the second translation for 2 reasons. First, the association of the Hebrew verb, adultery, with the prepositional letter, on, is reprehensible in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. Secondly, since we read in the story that the man was the one who initiated the pursuit of reconciliation with her, this indicates that he is responsible for her leaving home. But if we ask about the reason for the difference between the above 2 readings of verse 2, it is possible that the writer of the Hebrew text referred to adultery because in a society that does not give women the right to divorce, a woman leaving her home is considered committing adultery. On the road, a conversation takes place between the man and his servant, and the conversation deals with the issue of where to stay when darkness falls. The boy suggests Jebus, the city of Thebes, and Jerusalem is the temple of Delphi, and the man prefers Gibeah, or Ramah, 19:11-13. There in Gibeah, an old man hosted them. 2019. The house was surrounded by a group of young gay Benjamite, Lacedaemonians or Spartan, men. They demand to have sex with the guest. 22:19. The host suggests offering his virgin daughter and his guest's secret so that the wicked can do what they want with them. While the men were outside negotiating with the host, the guest, about whom we previously read that he went to console his concubine, handed over his concubine to the men. 25:19. And the concubine was the victim. The guest and host slept in the house, while the concubine suffered every indignity outside all night, and finally crawled in pain to fall on the doorstep. The Septuagint says that secrecy died, and this is what we see in the interpretive translation, indicated in parentheses, because it died. But in the Hebrew text, there is no reference to its death. In the 20th chapter, the children of Israel gather and agree to fight the children of Benjamin, and the leaders of all the people, all the tribes of Israel, stood in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 footmen, who drew the sword. Then the people of Benjamin heard that the children of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. And the children of Israel said, Speak, how has this abomination been? Then the Levite, Baal, answered the woman who was murdered and said, I and my concubine went to Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin, to spend the night. Then the men of Gibeah rose up against me and surrounded the house by night, intending to kill me, and they humiliated my concubine until she died. So I took my concubine, and cut her in pieces, and sent her into all the fields of the king of Israel, for they had done wickedness and abomination in Israel. After that, the children of Israel defeated Benjamin and burned all the cities belonging to the Benjaminites. The story told by the author of the chapter contains many signs of the true story, including the presence of the Ark of the Lord at that time. The puzzling thing here is not mentioning the names of the heroes of the story. It is most likely that the writer of the story is from the people of Judah, Ionians. He wanted to put his people in the story, as he did with Saul in his battle against the Persians. We go to Plutarch the historian in the story of the virginal rape of the two girls. Plutarch, the life of Pelopidas. Accordingly, it was decided to risk a battle, and at Leuctra they encamped over against the Lacedaemonians. Here Pelopidas had a dream which greatly disturbed him. Now, in the plain of Leuctra, are the tombs of the daughters of Cetus, who are called from the place Leuctride, for they had been buried there, after having been ravished by Spartan strangers. At the commission of such a grievous and lawless act, their father, since he could get no justice at Sparta, heaped curses upon the Spartans, and then slew himself, upon the tombs of the maidens, and ever after. Prophecies and oracles kept warning the Spartans to be on watchful guard against the Leuctrian wrath. Most of them, however, did not fully understand the matter, but were in doubt about the place, since in Laconia there is a little town, near the sea which is called Leuctra, and near Megalopolis in Arcadia there is a place of the same name. This calamity, of course, occurred long before the battle of Leuctra. After Pelopidas had lain down to sleep in the camp, he thought he saw these maidens weeping at their tombs, as they invoked curses upon the Spartans, and Cetus bidding him sacrifice to his daughters a virgin with auburn hair, if he wished to win the victory over his enemies. The injunction seemed a lawless and dreadful one to him, but he rose upon and made it known to the seers and the commanders. Some of these would not hear of the injunction being neglected or disobeyed, adducing as examples of such sacrifice among the ancients, Menocius, son of Creon, Macaria, daughter of Heracles, and, in later times, Pherecydes the wise man, who was put to death by the Lacedaemonians, and whose skin was preserved by their kings, in accordance with some oracle, and Leonidas, who, in obedience to the oracle, sacrificed himself, as it were, to save Greece. 3. And, still further, the youths who were sacrificed by Themistocles to Dionysus Carnivorous before the sea fight at Salamis, for the successes which followed these sacrifices proved them acceptable to the gods. Moreover, when Agesilas, who was setting out on an expedition from the same place as Agamemnon did, and against the same enemies, was asked by the goddess for his daughter in sacrifice, and had this vision as he lay asleep at Aulis, he was too tender-hearted to give her. 25. And thereby brought his expedition to an unsuccessful and inglorious ending. Others, on the contrary, argued against it, declaring that such a lawless and barbarous sacrifice was not acceptable to any one of the superior beings above us, for it was not the fabled Typhons and giants who governed the world, but the Father of all gods and men. Even to believe in the existence of divine beings, who take delight in the slaughter and blood of men was perhaps a folly, but if such beings existed, they must be disregarded, as having no power, for only weakness and depravity of soul could produce or harbor such unnatural and cruel desires. While, then, the chief men were thus disputing, and while Pelopidas in particular was in perplexity, A filly broke away from the herd of horses and sped through the camp, and when she came to the very place of their conference, stood still. The rest only admired the color of her glossy mane, which was fiery red, her high mettle, and the vehemence and boldness of her neighing. But Theocritus the seer, after taking thought, cried out to Pelopidas, "Thy sacrificial victim is come, good man, so let us not wait for any other virgin, but do thou accept and use the one which heaven offers thee." So they took the mare and led her to the tombs of the maidens, upon which, after decking her with garlands, and consecrating her with prayers, they sacrificed her, rejoicing themselves, and publishing through the camp an account of the vision of Pelopidas and of the sacrifice. This is the story of the rape of virgin girls, which was written in the book of judgment in the Torah. Hesham Taher.